what I'm going to talk about today is cinema. So we have a show and tell. I will start because I understand some of you are taking Professor Smith's course in geography with geography. Namely, the term Middle East, which, as you know, is a colonial concoction. Some British officer, colonial officer sitting in London, he looked to his east. So when we say east, that's to his east. And then the east must have a far and a middle and a near. So thus we have departments of Far Eastern, Middle Eastern, and Near Eastern. And my own department has Middle East term in it. Your center has Middle Eastern. It is a term that has a history about which I spoke yesterday to some other students. As a result, when we talk about Middle Eastern cinema, we have to first begin to wonder what in the world could it be Middle Eastern cinema. Cinema, for example, what would be the last film that you saw? I bet Avatar, right? Now, Avatar, is it an American cinema? Is it American film? This is where we begin to ask questions. For example, in many ways, films that are produced in Hollywood, they are produced for a globalized audience. That is, people in New York, in Miami, in Hong Kong, in London, in Cairo. They watch it and they identify with it. They cheer for the hero. They are angry with the villain, etc. So films of that generic nature cannot be called American. But if you were to take a look at, for example, a movie like 4th of July, or a movie like, Any Given Sunday, a movie like Deer Hunter, they would be considered American cinema. Why? Because in my definition of national cinema corresponds to a national trauma. When nations have a trauma, they produce art, culture, literature, poetry, etc., that corresponds to that trauma. As a result, the most compelling trauma of, say, 20th century in American history, to begin with something about closer at home here, would be, say, the Vietnam War or the Civil Rights Movement. And then after the events of 9/11 and the US-led invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq would be closest thing that comes to trauma. So if you put the movies of, say, Kubrick or other filmmakers on Vietnam, that represents the phenomenon of a national trauma, namely combination of civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and the way filmmakers deal with it. Now, question of national cinema as a result is something endemic and global. And in the world of cinema, it begins early in the 20th century with the cinema of Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution of 1917. And again, that is a national cinema by virtue of the traumatic and epoch-making event of the Russian Revolution that filmmakers like Sergei Eisenstein begin to make films that correspond both thematically and formally. Okay? For example, Sergei Eisenstein had a particular way of cutting and pasting his short close-ups and long shots, for example. He was an innovator of a particular way of editing. And that formal destruction or a formal reconception of how a movie is put together is also the result of Russian Revolution, as are thematic concepts of Russian cinema of that period. The next important globally significant film around the world would be, for example, Italian neorealism. Italian neorealism also, again, as a mode of national cinema, corresponds with post-war trauma of post-Mussolini Italy, when filmmakers like De Sica and Fellini and etc. begin to deal with the trauma of Italy in the aftermath of the fascist uprising, when Cinecittà, the major filmmaking production company, was under Mussolini's control. Filmmakers take their cameras out of studios into the streets, into rural areas, etc., and that gives rise to a new mode of filmmaking that we know it in the history of cinema as Italian New Realism. The next phase, for example, would be French New Wave. If you look at filmmakers like Truffaut, for example, or Godard, many French filmmakers, they come to fruition in the aftermath of the 1950s, when French intellectuals, poets, filmmakers, philosophers, etc., come to terms with the post-colonial experiences of French after de Gaulle, thinking what it is that they have done in Africa, in North Africa in particular, after the Algerian Revolution and so forth. The same, I'm just going through the major signposts of national cinemas: Russian, Italian, French, and the next, in terms of its significance in global cinema and its impact, would be German New Wave. And German New Wave is a mode of filmmaking, Schlondorf and others, many prominent German filmmakers, that comes in the aftermath of the Holocaust, namely the German coming to terms with the horrors of Holocaust. How could it happen that they did what they did in the course of the Nazi Germany, etc. It is dealing with that particular anxiety that constitutes the agitation at the heart of German New Wave and the masterpieces that it produces. These are, as you see, mostly European films and for European filmmaking, and they have had global consequences. When we come to, as I said, in the United States, national traumas, the events that have had national consequences, such as the Civil Rights Movement or the Vietnam War or the events of post 9/11. After 9/11, over the last 7, 8 years, every summer I have taught a course at Columbia on cinema of 9/11 to see if anything is happening in cinema of 9/11 which is different from what was established and constituted and practiced perfectly in the aftermath of the Vietnam War by filmmakers like Stanley Kubrick. And the answer is no. There is nothing in terms of cinematic intervention, except, for example, the Hurt Locker, the most recent film that made it to a number of film festivals. There's something happening in the Hurt Locker that is beginning to grab attention in terms of a breakthrough, a thematic and formal breakthrough as to how do you deal with the events of 9/11. Now, if you look at world cinema around the globe, you come to people, say, like Kurosawa in Japan, master filmmaker. You see that the effect of Hiroshima on Kurosawa and his horror with violence, what is the nature of human violence, is written all over his cinema. Okay, there is no film of Kurosawa that this horror of Hiroshima, which he as a child witnessed the consequences of the atom bomb, he was never ever able to get rid of. But when you look at the makeup of his cinema, you see the extraordinary presence of at least three major strands in the making of Kurosawa's cinema as a national cinema of post-Hiroshima anxiety. One of them, which might appear as a surprise, is in fact American cinema of John Ford. John Ford's cinema, that is cinema of an Irish kid who came to the United States. His parents came to the United States, born and raised here in the 1920s and 30s, and his entire career is a projection of an American empire from the vantage point of a poor Irish boy, and Monument Valley, those of you who are a fan of John Ford's cinema, Monument Valley and John Wayne become the tabula rasa and the Ulysses of his epic filmmaking. And his epic filmmaking, John Ford's, is radically and constitutionally different from, say, David Lean, a British filmmaker who is also making movies about empire, but he is, David Lean, films like Lawrence of Arabia, Passage to India, Ryan's Daughter, all deal with pathologies of imperialism. What happens after the empire collapses, okay? John Ford had a very sanguine conception of empire because he's projecting an empire to come rather than reflecting back on an empire that has passed. John Ford, as a result, had a very crucial impact on Kurosawa, and in fact there is a correspondence between John Ford and John Wayne. John Wayne was on his way to Japan, and John Ford tells him, when you go there, go see Kurosawa, he's a fan of ours, and he was right. The second impact is, in fact, Russian literature. Dostoevsky, in particular, he turned Dostoevsky's novel Idiot into a film. He was also interested in Gorky, in lower depth of Gorky. He also turned into a movie, etc. The third influence on him is Shakespeare. He turned two of Shakespeare's tragedies, both King Lear in the form of the movie Lon that you may have seen, and also Throne of Blood, which is Macbeth. He turned them into film as well. The combination of this turns Kurosawa's cinema into an archetypal analysis of imperialism and the notion of empire. And as a result, he has had influence globally, including on movies like the low-cost films, Star Wars, etc., was very much influenced by Kurosawa. Now, when we talk as a result about filmmakers like Kurosawa, like John Ford, like David Lean, we are talking about master filmmakers who have constituted a global language for cinema. A global language that in many ways transcends national cinemas and national traumas that are translated into national cinema. And to put your geography to test, I'm going to give you examples. Once in a film festival in Locarno in Switzerland, I happened to see the following films from the following countries. A movie from Somalia. Professor Smith is going to test you on this. Somalia. Another from Syria. Third from Afghanistan. And a fourth from Tajikistan. Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. And they all looked alike visually, the way they were edited, the way that they were directed, etc. Why would that be the case? What these four countries had in common? One in Africa, one in the Middle East, one in Central Asia, two in Central Asia. Good guess, but no. Internal conflict? You're close, but not exactly. Long story short, the directors were all classmates in Gorky Institute in Moscow. You follow? So the way they were cutting was the way they were taught, Sergei Eisenstein's way of cutting in Moscow. So imagine your classmates, you know, your university is very international. Four of you go to become whatever. You have the same mindset. You think identically. And also they help each other financing and finding support, distribution, etc. is a networking business. Now, that is my absolute favorite example by way of showing how, and then if you look at the films in terms of their themes and storylines, etc., they have absolutely nothing to do with each other. That leads me to propose in every film that you see two axes. No, none of them is evil. One is a vertical axis, which is axis of national history, national politics, national consciousness, national identity, you know, that you look at the film the moment they talk Arabic or English or Japanese, etc. So, oh, you identify the vertical line of the national element. And the other is horizontal. And the horizontal is what I said, that these films looked all alike in terms of their visual registers, the way they appear, the way they place the camera. Okay, this may seem a ludicrous question for you, but if a filmmaker was here, as happens to be a filmmaker, where do you place the camera, okay, is a very crucial question. You can place the camera. That is, if the camera is, for example, placed right where it is, I didn't mean to use it as an example, but it's a marvelous example, that the location of the camera already can speak volumes about the anxiety of the filmmaker, okay, about his relationship, as in this case, to this room. Do you follow? He is standing very close to the exit. Means that there is an alienating element in terms of his relationship, that he's a guest. He's not one of us, as I don't mean to. Of course, you're one of us. But you can use that example also in painting. When you look at, for example, Orientalist painting, always ask yourself, where is the painter standing? Okay? And what is his location? Because the camera is a very treacherous instrument. You think it is also only shooting in one way, but is actually registering both ways. Because you have to be able to read it reverse. Where the camera is located tells you a lot about. For example, when there is a conflict in the Middle East, and when you have a movie, and the movie is standing on the shoulder of an Israeli soldier, okay, that is a POV of an Israeli soldier, so far as some bombing or some explosion or whatever else is concerned. Or an American soldier, or a Palestinian fighter, or a Iraqi whatever. Do you follow? Where is the location of the camera is very, very important. I posit this two axes, one vertical, one horizontal, and that only as so far as the location of the camera is concerned. You can expand it into editing, into narrative. Are you more visual, more verbal, etc.? By way of saying that when you look at a movie, there are two sets of information that are coming at you, and habitually, because we are mostly visually blinded, because our ears are much sharper, we get to know this, be attracted by the story, and the attraction of the story distracts your attention from what is happening visually. But cinema studies, the art of cinema, is in fact to detrain your ears and retrain your eyes, so you see more and you listen less. There are many reversals. For many years, for 4 years at Columbia, I had a blind student, Cyrus, who couldn't see anything. But precisely because he couldn't see anything, he would visualize what he was hearing, and even what he was not hearing. And to me, it was an extraordinarily pedagogical experience. You see, our cameraman just changed his location to prove a point, which is extra. Now, what I'm arguing is that in the making of an idea like Middle Eastern cinema, because Middle East, we don't know exactly where it is. It is a political proposition, okay? Is North Africa part of the Middle East? Yes, no, maybe. Is Egypt part of Africa or Middle East? Yes, no, maybe. Is Turkey part of the Middle East? Yes, no, maybe. We don't know, okay? Is Iran, is Afghanistan, is Pakistan, etc.? We don't know. And then what happens in this floating signifier called the Middle East is what happens, given that example, when you have a filmmaker from Morocco, one from Egypt, one from Israel, one from Palestine, one from Turkey, etc., and their cinematic sensibilities are identical. What do you do with a movie made in Israel-Palestine that, because Palestinians can't get permission for many of the shots that they need, their Israeli colleagues pretend that this is their movies so they can get permission, and the Palestinian filmmaker goes and shoots whatever it is that they want to shoot. So that becomes also a thing. Or what happens when you have an Israeli filmmaker like Amos Gittai and a Palestinian filmmaker like Hani Abu Asad, they're both influenced by Iranian cinema. They're both fascinated, say, by Amir Naderi's way of shooting. You follow? It screws up your politics, which is good. You follow? Because you need to identify with the different sets of sensibilities. Okay? Now, what I'm arguing, putting forward for your consideration, is the overriding of the horizontal over the vertical, overriding of the aesthetic over the politics, overriding of the visual over the verbal, overriding of the emotive, which comes through visual registers, over the didactic. And habitually, as soon as you come out of Avatar, so what was the movie about? So you write an email to your friend. One of my former students just wrote me, oh, what a wonderful class I had, and etc. On colonialism, because Avatar is a combination of Tarzan and Lawrence of Arabia, but in fantastic new technology. Or Mowgli, for that matter. Mowgli will also do, Jungle Book is also a good model. Is to allow you not to be distracted by the didactic, but pay attention to the emotive. Not to be distracted by the political, pay attention to the aesthetic. Not to be distracted by, oh, I just saw an Iranian film or an Arab film, etc., but by the visual. And in order to make my case, I'm going to show you a clip which has to do with cinematic will to power, okay? Cinematic will to power. Something that logically, when you see this, logically makes absolute no sense. The clip comes from a film by the Palestinian filmmaker Elia Suleiman, perhaps one of the most distinguished contemporary Palestinian filmmakers. Chronicle of Disappearance is one of his most famous, but this one is called Divine Intervention, Yadun Ilahiyya. And this is the particularity of Elia Suleiman's is that he appears in his own films, like Jacques Tati. The other thing about Elia Suleiman, which his film character, he abbreviates as ES, Elia Suleiman. I have an interview with him which is coming out soon, and I said, oh, I hear that ES stands for Edward Said. They said, no, no, it's for Elia Suleiman. He never talks. Elia Suleiman never talks in his films. He's not that he's dumb or the character is dumb, but there are in fact scenes that he makes fun of the fact that he doesn't speak because he comes to the microphone, but there is something wrong with the electricity, etc., and he never gets to talk. And this is a scene that you're going to see that he is traveling from Ramallah to Jerusalem to see his father. His father is in hospital. He has just had a collapse, is in hospital, heart attack. And he's in his car traveling in a highway. Okay? And this is what happens. There we go. That's okay, what the hell happened? This is what I mean by pure cinematic will to power. Apricot, you're having At most, you're thinking, oh, he's loitering and he's going to get a ticket for loitering, right? Throw the pit out. Cinematic, will to power. Visual takes over the political. Now, you can have, the reason I propose this is you can have, as many critics from around the globe have done, a political reading of this. A Palestinian, Israeli tank, bada boom, oh, look, he wished that he could do this. And there are all sorts of political interpretation, readings, and analysis, perfectly legitimate, perfectly possible, perfectly politically anchored, right? But nothing in the text, as we say, is other than a pure cinematic play. You follow? Unless and until, if you go to Avatar, to see Avatar, and you have your post-colonial spiel on you and constantly taking note, oh, wow, look, this and that, he goes native. You got it wrong. You have to go with the flow. You have to allow the joy and magic and play frivolity of the thing to work on you to see how the instrument works. This is frivolity. This is playfulness. This has nothing to do with logic. In fact, it suspends logic, okay? That thing that goes out of the window is logic, is reason, is politics, okay? It's a formal destruction. And in fact, formal destruction is definitive to Elia Suleiman's cinema. If you were to see, anyone has seen this film? Those of you who have seen it, it breaks the narrative. It has no, and in fact, when it has narrative, there are so many four-letter words in Arabic in the opening shot that my Arab friends reach for the ears because it's really obscene words that come out. So it is because the narrative, okay, the narrative does not do justice to what is at the heart of the issue. Okay, example. Another Palestinian filmmaker, Hani Abu Asad, has a movie called Rana's Wedding. Anybody has seen it? Rana's Wedding? So in Rana's Wedding, for example, Rana is getting married and so forth, but he has to navigate, she has to navigate her route around the checkpoints, etc. And there is one point that she has to cross, and there is a scene of what in Palestine we call intifada, huh? Kids throwing a stone at Israeli soldiers and Israeli soldiers on the other side. Now, how would you cinematically represent that? Where would you put your camera and then you say action and kids pretending they're throwing a stone and fake Israeli soldiers pretending that they're responding or whatever? In view of a reality which is far worse than that, namely the act of mimesis. You have a crisis of mimesis. You have a crisis of representation. Because in the act of representation, you have to exaggerate the reality in order to make a point. But when a reality has transcended exaggeration, how would you show it? So you have a crisis of representation. And how you transcend that crisis of representation, for example, in Hani Abu Asad's Ford Transit, another wonderful film of his is called Ford Transit, which is a story of a Palestinian cab driver. When he comes to a Makhsoom, to a checkpoint, suddenly there is a fade out of all sounds, and who should come out as soundtrack? Dr. Dre. Okay, from gang rap. You get gang rap, and you cross-feed it into a Palestinian situation, and what you have a cross-metaphorization between two forms of rebellion, and they sustain it themselves. These are creative ways that cinematically, visually, verbally, aesthetically, poetically, etc., you overcome the crisis of mimesis, representation that you have. The second thing I'm going to show you is from a film by Iranian filmmaker Majid Majidi. The film is called Baran. Baran means rain, but in this case, it is also the proper name of a young Afghan woman who is a child laborer, who is a laborer in Iran. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, upward of 2 million Afghans went into Iran. and they were subject to all sorts of harassments and racism and so forth. And yet they stayed and they worked. And yeah, and many masterpieces of contemporary Iranian cinema, in fact, deal with the plight of Afghans, beginning with Mohsen Makhmalbaf's Cyclist, and his other film, Kandahar. Many films have been made about Afghans in Iran. This by Majid Majidi is also about the condition of Afghans in Iran, but it's a love story. It's a love story between a young Iranian man and a young Afghan woman. And there are all sorts of traumas because they are illegal immigrants and etc. And the scene that I'm going to show you is a scene that finally the young woman and her family are leaving. They're packing and leaving. And the young man is very desperate, very anxious, doesn't know what to do, and is simply rushing to the home where this woman is living, and they're packing and about to leave, and this is what happens. This is where a shoemaker used to stand, and he was also a kind of a mystic figure, and he's no longer there. That's what it all means. This is some memento, a hairpin that accidentally she gave it to him at some point. اونو وای زدی دست کن چیشم خونی بعدشم خوبه. If we were to talk about poetry in visual terms, this is poetry in visual terms. And the way I submit it for your consideration is when the visual overrides the verbal, when the aesthetic overrides the political. Now, politically, any form of physical intimacy in Iranian cinema is absolutely forbidden, verboten, no. No touching. No touching. Don't touch, right? So how would you show physical intimacy? Okay? How would you show affection? How would you show love? How would you show etc.? An art magazine managed somehow to get hold of 100 frames of this shot after the editor heard me talk about this shot. And in it, what I argue, and with which I conclude and hope we have a chance to speak, is the following. That the act of putting the burqa down, taking the burqa up and bringing it down by virtue of inhibition, don't look, don't touch, get away, right? This is what this gesture is supposed to do. Visually, you turn it exactly against it. Namely, that gesture, that very gesture, becomes hugging. She hugs him. That's the visually hugging of him. You follow? Instead of through the same, when the single act becomes double signifier. With the one act, it says, don't look, looking forbidden, get away from me, my dad is coming, etc. The police is on its way, the Basijis may see, all of these things that that very act that implicates all of these things at the very same time, that's the paradox of it, is also hugging. That gesture of hugging. Majidi is not the first or the only one who has done it. Makhmalbaf has done it. Many people have done it. In fact, equally compelling and beautiful shot is in Makhmalbaf's Nunu Goldun, A Moment of Innocence. At the very last shot of A Moment of Innocence, you can see it. To conclude, what I'm suggesting is, next movie that you see that is called From Middle East, occasionally just don't listen, turn the volume down, and just train your eyes, because we habitually don't see and only look for stories. Forget about a story and train your eyes, and you're up for a new wonder. Thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to answer any questions, comments you might have. My take on the question of foreign and familiar, not in these two cases that I showed you, to be a Palestinian or to be an Iranian doesn't necessarily mean that you are familiar with the language of cinema. And number one, and conversely, being an American or a Russian or a Japanese doesn't necessarily mean you're alien to the language of cinema. In fact, these films have, as you know, in Palestine, there is no movie theater. Is a different story. But in Iran, the people who will actually get to see what is called art films, art cinema, are as few as they are in any other percentage-wise as a result. So what your point about the context is absolutely correct. But my conception of context is a combination of narrative and visuality. And in fact, sometimes knowing verbality is a hindrance. And I give you a very good example. There is a movie by Iranian filmmaker Jafar Panahi called The White Balloon, right? Because Jafar Panahi himself is from North Azerbaijan area, he's very sensitive in his cinema to restore dignity to the Persian that is spoken with different accents. Somebody speaks it in Turkish accent, Rashti accent, Armenian accent, etc. I saw this film in New York with an American colleague of mine, and by and large, Iranian audience. Every time somebody spoke Persian with a Turkish accent, the audience started laughing. There was nothing funny about the dialogue. Or with a Rashti accent, because in their mind, racialized mind, they hear racialized jokes, but there is nothing funny about the line. Whereas the American who doesn't get the codified, his mind is not codified, the Turkish jokes or Rashti jokes or Armenian jokes, etc., doesn't get it. And as a result, is closer to the getting of the point of the film, which is restoring dignity to the accents of people speaking Persian from varieties of parts of Iran. Whereas the Iranian audience, which is supposed to be closer, is completely missing the point, because it has to go cross over the racialized accents and so forth in order to get the point, which is, so we need, as a result, stick to your notion of context is necessary, but be more flexible in seeing how new contexts are generated. And also, in the context, if you become too nationalized, nativist, you forget about how Ozu has had more influence on Abbas Kiarostami than Sohrab Sepehri as a filmmaker. John Ford has had more influence on Amir Naderi than any other Iranian filmmaker. Tangsir is a Western film shot in southern Iran. You follow? So what I'm suggesting is not to disregard the localized context, but to expand and multiply it, which provides better ways of, more richer forms of understanding it. I categorically don't believe in the idea East and West, certainly in cinema. It makes no sense. All filmmakers horizontally are influenced by other filmmakers, and however they are committed to some political, and all filmmakers are political, national, historical, societal, etc. issue. When push comes to shove, their cinematic commitment to their art, filmmakers that are serious filmmakers are more important. Now, your point about pace is absolutely correct, but that's as a cinematic tradition. Oliver Stone's Any Given Sunday has 500 cameras around a football game, and he cuts 300 cuts every second, okay? But that is the speed with which we, and these gadgets, you follow? If it is a split second of delay, we say, hey, move, you dinosaur, right? That's the speed with which we now, it is gargantuan speed with which our inner clock is accentuated. Now, this is a different cinema than a cinema of, as you said, Abbas Kiarostami puts the camera here, goes home, takes a nap, comes back, says cut. It's a whole different pace. Do you follow? And that, you look at Amos Gitai's, the Israeli filmmaker Amos Gitai's Kadosh, exact. Ozu, Japanese filmmaker, is the same. That is, every filmmaker, every great filmmaker generates and sustains her or his own inner clock. And they couldn't care less if you get bored or you're too excited, etc. They train you. They are ambitious enough to train your inner clock in a different way. Now, what is confusing about Western cinema, Eastern cinema, is that we confuse Hollywood filmmaking, which is made for testosterone, infested teenagers with a certain speed. Do you follow? Which we take it Western cinema. But no, kids in Hong Kong and in Bombay are as much excited by these things as they are in New York and Miami, perhaps. So we are talking about the targeted audience rather than Jim Jarmusch is American, right? So what about his films? His speeds don't follow those sorts of speeds. So East and West, as all other notions of East and West, collapses when you come to the details of a specific filmmakers and who worth their names, and you see they generate their own inner speed for the purpose of whatever it is that they're. Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket and Oliver Stone's 4th of July, they follow two different speeds depending on what it is that they want to do. So East-West collapses. Doesn't make any sense. Oh, silence. The same is with silence. That the filmmakers like Ozu or like Kiarostami, they allow silence. Kiarostami, even the documentary that he made in Africa about AIDS, for darkness. How long do you sustain complete darkness in a cinematic adventure without losing the audience? And it works. I forget now the exact number of seconds and minutes, but it is the longest darkness in the history of cinema, and you're sitting there and just looking at a black thing. And it makes perfect sense. But it makes sense by virtue of Kiarostami training your eyes and your ears and your patience gradually, systematically, over a long period of time that you don't, whereas if in the middle of an Oliver Stone movie you have a split second of silence or a split second of darkness, you don't know what to do with yourself. Do you follow? I used to do that. It was a cruel moment in my career as a teacher. I used to, we have something at Columbia called CCN at home, Contemporary Civilization. All kids, it's a core curriculum requirement distribution. They all have to take it. And the students' body language is so trained. You sit down, you put the paper and now his laptop in front of you, and you start typing. It's automatic, it's instinctive, and it doesn't matter what gibberish the professor is saying. You just, your body language is geared to go that way. So I will go to my class, sit in front of everybody, and don't utter a word for like 2 minutes. Is the most anxiety-provoking moment in the history of humanity. The kids don't, because they want to elide into that moment of bada-boom, this, and so the decorum goes up, and I disallow it. Okay, and it's a very anxiety, because it doesn't go with the rhythm that we have professionally, habitually, etc., constituted, doesn't allow it to sort of elide into it, so it's anxiety-provoking. So speed is not something accidental or silence or darkness. How much of it is, which also has to do with the tolerance of gaze. Okay, with tolerance, the gaze that we habitually and culturally accept that is on us is perfectly punctuated and modulated. If I were to look at any one of you for more than we have collectively, culturally, habitually accepted is the duration of the gaze, you will get nervous, and the vice versa. Okay? That is, if you look at me for a split second longer for what we have collectively agreed is the right duration, I'll get a thing. anxious and maybe there is something wrong with me. So don't think that the duration of gaze, how much we're looking, is all accidental, is not accidental. Irving Goffman, great American anthropologist, the presentation of self in everyday society, 1960s and 70s. He was my old professor at Penn when I was a graduate student. He used to, while he was writing presentation of self in everyday society, disrupt. For example, in the elevator, he will drop his pants to see how people will sort of reconfigure themselves and and start taking notes. The question that Western cinema, as I said, as a category, doesn't hold, because if you look at it from a European perspective, American cinema doesn't look as natural as it is here. It is only natural when the political looks natural here, when we look at it here, when we are bombarded with the fusion of the propaganda and cinema. But when you look at it from a European perspective, anywhere from England to France to wherever, it is no longer as natural. It is very, very artificial. Do you follow? And as a result, it's much more open to criticism or decontextualizing in the context in which it was produced, recontextualizing in a far more critical perspective. Recently, Avatar was shown in Israel. And a leading anti-war activist stood up in the middle of a movie theater and says, "Oh, Avatar, that's Israel and Palestine." You follow? That is not the context that Cameron made the movie, and that's not the context in which people see it in Miami or New York or Los Angeles. That means you're seeing it in a different context and you recontextualize it. So naturalization is only when you are seeing it where it was built. On the other side of the thing, first of all, you have a constellation of filmmakers. Talking about Palestinian cinema, Michel Khalifi is far more directly political than Elia Suleiman is. Elia Suleiman is a third-generation Palestinian filmmaker. And it is not that he is not political. He is political in a more formally destructive way. Far more formally, because formally, Michel Khalifi is very conventional. He's like Bertolucci in his aesthetic thing. So when he comes shooting from the hip politically, people applaud, etc. But in his cinematic language, he's very conservative. Whereas Elia Suleiman he's not compromising. I mean, the fact that he travels with an Israeli passport and, as he always says, has a darker conception of being a Palestinian. But my comment was we have to allow for expansion of the context without compromising the point of self-censorship or appealing to film festivals and so forth. But cinema, if anything, is the art of multiple significations. That is, you produce it, you put it out there, you have no control how it begins to sing and dance in various contexts. And the natural aspect of how a movie is received here in the United States is totally denaturalized when it is seen in other places.